Before we even get into this article, I need to make something crystal clear. I do not support child marriage. I do not support selling little girls into marriage. I do not support selling children into domestic servitude. And I do not care what culture, religion, or economic system tries to justify it. A 5-year-old little girl is not property. She is not a financial asset. She is not a bargaining chip to be handed to an adult man. What's happening in parts of Afghanistan is horrifying. Now, with that said, I also think it's important to understand why things like this happen instead of reducing the conversation to emotional slogans and outrage farming. Because there's a difference between explaining something and excusing it. Extreme poverty, economic collapse, Taliban rule, loss of education, tribal traditions, and cultural acceptance of child marriage have created conditions where some families are making absolutely horrific decisions out of desperation. Understanding that context does not make the practice morally acceptable. In fact, I'd argue the opposite. A society that allows little girls to become transferable assets during hard times has a serious cultural and moral problem that deserves criticism. And no, before somebody twists my words, I am not saying all Afghan people support this. I'm not saying every family would do this. I'm not saying poverty automatically turns people into monsters. But I am saying this. There are lines that should never be crossed, no matter how desperate things get. And selling little girls to adult men is one of them. So with that established, let's actually break down the article, the data, and the bigger conversation that a lot of people are either oversimplifying or refusing to have honestly. The article from the BBC focuses on families in Afghanistan who are reportedly selling young daughters into marriage or domestic servitude in order to survive extreme poverty and hunger. And unfortunately, this isn't some isolated horror story pulled out of nowhere. Afghanistan has been in economic freefall since the Taliban returned to power in 2021. International aid collapsed, foreign assets were frozen, unemployment exploded, food insecurity skyrocketed, and entire regions have been pushed into survival-level poverty. According to multiple humanitarian reports, millions of Afghans are struggling to meet basic food needs. Now that context matters, but here's where I think some media coverage starts becoming emotionally manipulative instead of fully honest. A lot of Western reporting frames these stories almost exclusively around impossible choices, as if the entire issue can be explained away purely through poverty. I disagree with that framing. Poverty matters, desperation matters, but culture matters too, because economic collapse by itself does not automatically produce child marriage or the selling of little girls to adult men. For that to happen, there already has to be a cultural and legal framework where girls are viewed as transferable assets inside the family structure. And that's one of the uncomfortable conversations people in the West are often afraid to have honestly, because they don't want to sound judgmental toward another culture. But morality doesn't suddenly stop existing at a border. If a society tolerates child marriage, bride price systems, or the treatment of young girls as economic bargaining tools, then yes, I think those practices deserve moral condemnation regardless of where they happen. And I think pretending otherwise out of fear of sounding insensitive is cowardly. At the same time, I also think it's intellectually dishonest to look at starving people living inside a collapsing country and reduce all of this to, these are just evil people. Reality is darker and more complicated than that. History shows us over and over again that when societies collapse, human beings start doing horrifying things in order to survive. Selling children, debt slavery, forced labor, human trafficking, child labor, survival prostitution, even abandoning family members during famine. That doesn't make those actions moral. It means desperation can erode moral boundaries in terrifying ways. And honestly, one of the most damaging parts of this entire situation is what's happened to girls' education under Taliban rule. When girls lose access to school, independence, and future economic opportunity, marriage stops being viewed as one possible path and starts becoming the only path many families can imagine for them. That creates a vicious cycle. Poverty leads to dependency, dependency leads to early marriage reinforces poverty, and the cycle repeats across generations. But I also don't want people sanitizing what these arrangements can actually mean in practice. When people hear phrases like marriage arrangement or domestic servitude, they sometimes mentally soften what's actually happening. We are talking about extremely vulnerable little girls being handed over to adult-controlled households where they can be exposed to abuse, exploitation, coercion, violence, and potentially rape. That reality should not be hidden behind softer language. And this is where I think the broader conversation matters, because there's a dangerous trend in modern discourse where people either completely demonize entire populations, or they become so terrified of judging another culture that they refuse to morally condemn anything at all. I reject both extremes. I do not believe all Afghan people support this. I do not believe every family would make this choice. And I absolutely believe there are people there who are horrified by these practices too. But I also refuse to pretend that cultural norms play no role in allowing these systems to exist. Poverty may explain desperation. It does not automatically excuse every action taken under desperation. And I think it is completely reasonable to say, a society should never normalize the treatment of little girls as property, no matter how difficult conditions become. Because if we lose the ability to say that clearly, then morality itself becomes negotiable, the second survival gets hard. And that's a terrifying place for any civilization to end up.